Vladimir Putin arrives for a two-day trip to Egypt in a bid to boost influence in the Middle East, while tension boils in the Egyptian street and the blame turns to police after 19 die in a football game turned violent. In a joint press conference at the White House on Ukraine, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the peace of Europe itself is at stake. And despite denials from the Israeli Labor Party, I-24 News finds that one of the main financial backers of the political nonprofit V15 has also donated money to Labor Party leader Isaac Herzog. Good evening. For the first time in a decade, Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Egypt. And though the visit is to one country, it involves a host of global conflicts and interests. With Russia under constant fire for its involvement in the Ukraine crisis and in a showdown with the West, the trip to Cairo is an opportunity to flex some political muscle, boost influence in the Middle East, and maybe even ink an arms deal along the way. But he's arriving while Egypt is on edge yet again, this time after a football match turned violent in a stampede and clashes that left 19 people dead. And it's in a country where football isn't just football, but often a major element in politics. We'll go to our analysts in Cairo, but first, here's a look back. And joining me on set tonight is Avi Melamed, Head of Intel and Mideast Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute. Good evening. Thanks very much for being with me.
Good evening.
And Professor of Political Science, Dr. Hani Zubaydah. Good to see you back here.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
So I want to begin, before we get to the all-important football in Egypt, which is clearly a big political issue. On the agenda for Putin in Egypt is Iraq, Syria, Libya, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A lot for 2 days. What's really on the agenda? What's the top focus of Putin in Cairo?
Economics, and mostly for the Egyptian. There are major issues that has to be dealt between the sides. It's not a parallel relationship, obviously. They are not in the same position. But what's interesting today, Egypt today, the most in that context is first and foremost economy. In the middle of March, there's supposed to be a big conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. Al-Sisi is doing a lot of efforts to bring investment here into Egypt. He's doing a lot of efforts in order to boost the economy in Egypt, and rightly so, he needs to do that. There is an ongoing relationship between Egypt and Russia, and for the last couple of months, it's been definitely
a blossoming relationship.
A blossoming relationship, and there are a couple of economic issues that are on stake. Now, it's kind of like unfair, sort of speaking, because it's mostly one-way flow. I mean, Russia provides Egypt with two of its most important assets. One is tourists that are coming to Sharm el-Sheikh to enjoy the beautiful sun and sea and so forth. And the other thing is flour, which
really?
is, yeah, Russia provides...
What about weapons?
Weapon is also there, but that's
less pleasant, less tourism.
It's there, but that's not the real issue. There are a couple of things that I find very interesting. One is the, as I said, like the tourism, the flour, wood, very interesting industry. Russia provides Egypt with wood, and Egypt provides back Russia with carpentry stuff that is being done. The industry of carpentry in Egypt is very big and very important. In the context of the flour, it's very interesting. Egypt wants to basically offer Russia to store huge amount of flour that Russia wants to market the different markets in the world, in that way to profit from that. And then there is another interesting aspect that maybe we should talk about it later on. Nuclear facilities.
Oh, so there's flour, there's a little wheat, there's some tourism, and then there's nuclear facilities.
Welcome to the world.
Let's get to that in just a moment. In the Middle East, of course, it's not just tourism. Before we return to this, football. Clearly, as I mentioned in the opener, 19 people dead in a football match seems extreme. But in Egypt, as we saw just in 2011, ouster of Mubarak, football means politics. Is this as serious as that incident?
Well, let's set the matter straight. 17, 19, 25 dead. The number is not that finalized, but dead people in football matches are not something unique to Egypt. We had the Hillsborough incident. We had other incidents in which people found their death on the football pitch. That's not a stranger. In other games, what we saw are clashes between fans before the game, prior to the game, outside of the stadium, ended up with the police finding bodies. Just 2 months ago in Spain, in a derby between Espanyol and another team, I think it was Atletico Madrid, but I'm not Atletico Bilbao, I think. 2 people, one found himself dead and the other one wounded critically. So football and death, usually when we see that combination in a very heated matches, it's no surprise. There must be
football politics and death is another
exactly. But here goes the other issue with football in developing world or in what we call third world countries. In Egypt, the 2 major teams are Al Ahly and Zamalek. Now, when you are in Egypt and somebody will ask you when you walk into a cabin, somebody did that to me.
It's a profile.
And he said,
Someone
he said,
who you are,
which
by
team,
what team?
Which team do you support, Al Ahly or Zamalek? And people warned me up front. So I said, leave me of Al Ahly and Zamalek. Let's talk about the team
Stay
of the
neutral.
country. No, we spoke about the
politics.
national team. We spoke about the national, because when you speak about Al Ahly or Zamalek, it's something that exceeds football. It's a status form. It is political belonging. It's a class belonging. It's also an issue of living, geographical living. Where do you live in Egypt or in Masr, Cairo? There are so many things entrenched in one simple question, Al Ahly or Zamalek. Now, the thing is, after the upheaval in Egypt, after Mubarak was set off his position, we saw one major incident which ended up with 70 dead, if I'm not mistaken, in Port Said.
Yep.
And they decided to stop the league. The league renewed itself less than a year ago. And they decided to open the stadiums back in December. So we are about like 2.5 months since they opened the stadiums. And already we have an incident. Everything I read goes back to the fact that the police, this time, the police has done something to incite or not take the situation in the right manner. Now, I should say something. In Europe, because they know that football generates billions of euros, they decided on sterile areas outside the stadium. So when you walk into a major stadium in Europe, and no matter which game it is, it can be between Inter and Milan, it can be full of hatred between the fans, it is a family-oriented experience.
Before we get further into just how deep this football game is getting into politics, let's take a look at the whole picture before we continue. Uri Shapir looks back at the ever-changing Russian and American ties with Egypt.
This is not how Egypt intended to welcome Russian President Vladimir Putin. A day before Putin's landmark visit to Cairo, more than 19 people died in confrontation with the police at a soccer game in Cairo. Most of the victims suffocated when the crowd stampeded after police used tear gas to clear fans who tried to rush into the stadium, where 2 Cairo clubs were playing in the Egyptian League. This severe incident comes only 10 days after a wave of terror swept the Sinai Peninsula, causing dozens of casualties. This is the first visit to Egypt by a Russian president since the Mubarak administration was toppled in 2011. Russia and Egypt are considered close allies, and the connection between the 2 countries became even stronger after Abdel Fattah el-Sisi became Egyptian president in 2014, a move that changed the entire region and shook the long-lasting ties between Egypt and the US. Last year, Russia and Egypt reached a preliminary arms deal worth $3.5 billion.
Bilateral ties between Russia and Egypt are old, in particular in military areas, and this was discussed by the Russian defense minister with his Egyptian counterpart yesterday.
During the two-day visit, Putin and al-Sisi will discuss such topics as the violence engulfing the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But perhaps both leaders will have to face the challenges closer to their respective homes, growing violence and terrorism in Egypt and the ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine.
And joining us to the conversation here in the studio from Cairo's journalist Annabel van der Berge. Annabel, good evening. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
So in the report we saw signs of Vladimir Putin getting a hero's welcome in Cairo, really positive, at least on the surface. Is that the sort of perception? Can we say that beyond the Egyptian government that Putin is seen as some sort of a hero or savior in Egypt at the moment?
Well, we must say that this is basically a feeling that is very clear with the government, but for the people in the street it is a bit different, of course. What we know is that in the past Egypt had very good relationships with the United States, and as we know, the relationships between the United States and Russia are not very good. So people are actually expecting in the streets that the relationships between the Egyptian government and the government of the United States will improve sooner or later. And they are also hoping that it will improve very soon because the United States are known for subsidizing and also sending financial aid to Egypt for the military. And at this point, the military is very important in Egypt.
So we've seen the United States has been criticized for a little bit of flip-flopping on policy, of course, in the Middle East in general, but specifically in Egypt with the ouster of Mubarak, ouster of Morsi, now el-Sisi in power. What is you describe the feeling in the Egyptian street towards Washington as quite positive. Is that the sense that they're sort of waiting for Obama to come back to Egypt to renew funding?
Well, people in the street, you must know that almost everybody knows somebody who has or who has been serving in the army. So the army plays a very important role in Egyptian society overall. So we, of course, have the activists that are, until this moment, very much against the army and against the police because Egypt has become, in a way, some kind of a police state. But in general, we know that the people are still in favor of the army, that people are still protecting and still wanting more of the police and the army in the streets. And therefore, they are very fond as well of the United States because the United States have played, for the last decades, a very important role in financing the Egyptian army and basically being an important ally to guarantee the security in Egypt and the stability.
Annabel, you mentioned the police presence in the street. Obviously, el-Sisi has been sort of waging a campaign, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula, against terror, against jihadism that is coming out against his forces. Is there a sense that he's succeeding in that fight?
Well, we must say that he is definitely making advances when it comes to the Sinai. Now, what we see as well is that there has been several attacks as well in Cairo and in other cities of Egypt. And there we can tell that it is a bit more difficult to really take control or keep control and keep security in the streets of Egypt. Now, we have to add to that as well that the attacks outside of the Sinai are a lot smaller in general. The devices are more improvised. They are targeting also police stations, also the army, but there are less victims than, for example, the attacks that we've seen in the Sinai. But it is, of course, also important to mention that yesterday there was, that last weekend there was this big problem, this big escalation during a football game where at least 30 people, probably even 40 people, have been killed when it came to clashes between supporters of the Zamalek football team and the police who were trying to keep control over that game.
Right. A lot of different numbers there and different kind of views of it. For now, yeah. Annabel van der Berge in Cairo, thanks very much for joining us.
Most welcome.
So before we get to the nuclear point for a moment, as Annabel mentioned, there's the kind of alternating benefactors of the United States and Russia for Egypt. Putin is obviously here to boost Middle East influence at a time when he's looking a little bit weak, or is at least challenged on other subjects. Does Putin strengthening Russian influence in Egypt necessarily mean the United States is on its way out? Is it one or the other?
No, not necessarily. Putin is recognizing today a couple of opportunities, and he's doing what every leader should do, trying to use or to maximize the opportunities. There is a sort of a kind of a vacuum. The United States is being perceived today more and more by different factors in the region as a declining force, even though it's not the situation. Putin is trying to go in. There is another important thing that basically Putin and al-Sisi shares very deeply. They both loathe the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
Which is very important for both.
And I mean, the last time Putin was there was in 2005 with Mubarak, so it's like a coming home in a sense.
By the way, Russia was almost one of the first ones to congratulate, following the rebellion in Egypt that ousted the Muslim Brotherhood.
The United States was very unclear
Well, the United
about
States was very cautious about it. But I think we have to be clear about it. It's not about replacing the United States. It's not. It's about finding the opportunities and finding some kind of a niche that both sides could benefit from. This is what we call real politics, which is very good for both sides in the end of the day.
Putin seems to be quite smart of all the world leaders we're seeing, all the actions at the moment.
I assume Putin would have loved to tie new diplomatic notches with the European countries or other major countries, but nobody would talk to him. So eventually, at the end of the day, when he makes his math and he looks at the list of countries, he finds Egypt there and he says, well, yeah, let's go to Egypt. It's not like other countries are waiting there to say, well, Putin, come over. We need flour and we need some nuclear weapons. It's not happening this way. And mostly, as we know, Russia is not a manufacturing country. We've seen that in the last year and a half. They're literally being torn apart by the fact that they are a zero manufacturing state. What they're selling is only resources, which they have tons of. And when the United States decided that Putin is overstepping his boundaries in the Ukraine, they decided to flood the market with the black gold. Right. And then all of a sudden, we saw Russia literally crumbling. I do not think that the United States really want Russia to crumble, because then mayhem will start in Europe, but they want to keep them in check. And when it comes to Egypt, nobody can really replace the United States today.
There are those who sort of argue something like what you're saying, that by Europe and the United States sort of shutting Russia out increasingly with more sanctions and so on, they're actually responsible for pushing Russia elsewhere, like you're saying, to Egypt among them. Is the U.S. sort of at fault? Is its policy at fault?
Well, it's not that they're at fault. It's what happens in international relations. There's a sheriff in town. The name of the sheriff is Barack Obama. There's another sheriff in town.
Is he still the sheriff?
Well, yes, definitely is. Definitely is. Well, there are other interests in the Middle East. The EU is playing a major role in the Middle East. However, as we saw, the EU and the United States are, so to say, synchronized, more than they are with Putin, definitely. And I think they are trying as hard as they can not to overstep their boundaries when it comes to relationship of the United States or the EU in the Middle East. And the EU has major issues within the EU. Issues of identity, boundaries, immigration, economy. What will Egypt do? Of course, Egypt is now literally... Germany is holding the EU together. Financially, they're holding the EU together. Now, there are questions. And I think the United States reacted to what they thought as a very aggressive move by Putin in the Ukraine. And as a result, Putin is looking for other venues.
Looking for other friends.
Yeah, of course. And that's a...
So his other friends, you mentioned some of them are looking for the nuclear department.
Yeah, Russia just recently signed a deal with Turkey. A Russian company won a bid to build a nuclear reactor for civil purposes in Jordan. It was already a couple of years ago. Egypt has its small, modest nuclear facility and research project. This is something that could be there. It's not the main issue, but it will probably come up. But I think one of the interesting things I would very much like to be, I would like to be fly on the wall during that meeting. That would be interesting. Because one of the things I wonder is whether they're going to talk a little bit about Syria. Because I think that some of the interesting things that I noticed recently, Sisi is not only operating domestically in terms of economy and fighting terrorism and so forth, he's also starting to make signs that he's going back to the arena as a regional player. And one of the things that he was doing, I think we talked about it last time I was here, he was hosting this conference of Syrian opposition leaders in Cairo. Right. It'll be very interesting to see what they will talk specifically in the context of Syria, bearing in mind that Russia is facing a lot of challenges because the prices of oil went down so significantly, and the keys is within the hands of the Saudis.
Of Saudi Arabia. So all of this is connected, and the common denominator that you bring up, Syria seems to be the common denominator in the fight against the Islamic State, alongside all these other alliances and oil prices, and the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran is Syria. So where does El-Sisi stand right now on Syria? What is his position?
I think that he's trying to consolidate his situation exactly because there are different players involved. Up until now, it's amazing. Egypt, the most important Arab state, ever since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, Egypt have never stepped to the plate and make a very clear position regarding the situation.
They've remained remarkably neutral. Relatively speaking.
It mostly indicates the huge inner challenges of Egypt. Literally speaking, Egypt is so busy with its challenges and problems, they didn't really have time to start dealing with the problem of the Syrians, which is unbelievable, bearing in mind the fact that in the late 50s, the two states were together in an alliance for a short period of time.
They were aiming for the Al-Arabiya. Then Gamal Abdel Nasser said it out loud. I want to join the Arab world into the grand notion of the Al-Arabiya.
A notion that collapsed.
Well, a notion that never really took off. But I agree. I think the analysis is precise. We should also throw into the equation Iraq, which is falling apart, and nobody can really patch anything. Everybody talks about the Ayatollah of Iran. Nobody really looks at the Ayatollah of Iraq, which is now torn back to the pre-colonial days with the single tribes that are fighting inner fights, Shiite, Sunnite, Sufis, some Christians, the Kurds, of course, obviously. Now, I think, well, it's a very complicated issue. And I think right now most of the Syrian burden is falling upon the Turks, especially in the Kurd area.
Are they taking, of course, in the terms of refugees, they're certainly doing a huge part.
Yes,
but
also Jordan and Lebanon.
Yeah. Only refugees issue. Right now, nobody wants to deal with them, in my opinion, with the Syrian issue, because they're waiting for somebody to save the day, as you said, step up to the plate. Nobody's willing to do that because...
And in the meantime, it's a little bit of arming to the moderate Syrian rebels, whatever that means. It's some airstrikes, but it's full commitment.
Nobody has said anything out loud. Nobody has what you call supported formally any of the sides. The first to do that were the Druze in the Golan Heights in Israel, and they supported Assad, and obviously something that exploded in their faces after a short while. And ever since, what we see is kind of like a status quo. And with ISIS going into the equation as well, nobody really wants to touch this hot potato in the Middle East because everybody's afraid from the tomorrow. What will happen tomorrow?
Right, who will be in power tomorrow?
Exactly.
Because now there's also word of the United States sort of reversing its no more Assad policy because maybe they start to see that that's not the most realistic, whether they like it or not.
I've been saying for a long time ago, and it's kind of like this sentiment is being more and more reiterated and strengthened in the Middle East, different parts of the Middle East. There are more and more people in the Middle East, I'm talking about Arab analysts, that argue today that actually what we see today is a major shift in the American strategy that is manifested in the fact that, according to their mindset, Obama decided to bet on the Iranian horse and to neglect and abandon the Sunni Arab horse. I'm not so sure that they are wrong.
It looks like it. If we're talking about listening, sanctions being a little, maybe needing Iran in the fight against IS and going a little bit easier on the nuclear talks.
You know, one of the interesting indicators was given in another arena, which is very interesting, talking about this troubled Middle East, and this is a place called Yemen. The Houthis are taking over Yemen, and the White House spokesperson basically says that they found no indicators that the Iranians are massively or practically supporting the Houthis. Well,
your smile, your half smile sort of says that that's not completely correct.
Maybe they need someone to translate the announcement that came from Iran, openly stating their big satisfaction with the fact that the Houthis took over Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. But maybe the American needs some translators.
And meanwhile, the Iranian influence builds and builds in Iraq.
It's a blind eye to the situation. They see what they want to see, and they don't see what they don't want to see.
This is I have to say, a very proud American trait. You see?
Yeah, exactly. It's the don't ask, don't tell policy. We're not asking you, so please don't tell us who you're supporting right now.
Arguably a very outdated policy. Let's pause for a moment.
Which backfired to the American day in, day out.
So let's take a small pause for a moment. All of this is, of course, part of a greater Middle Eastern game of alliances and influence, as we've been discussing. So we asked Israelis on the street if they think Russia is headed for a major role here in the Middle East. Let's hear.
No, so I think he should solve the problem in Russia first and let us deal with the problem here. I think he had enough problem in Russia before he should get involved in other problems around the world.
Russia is a superpower, like the US. It should have a say in politics.
Definitely Israel should have a good relation to Russia because they have a influence on Syria. And that's why I think Israel should have good relations with Russia.
Because it's visit. We want to make a good business there with Egypt. That's all.
I think nobody should be a world player, so I think a balance of power would be the best for everybody's freedom.
No, we have enough problems of our own. We don't need international problems. Let Putin deal with his own issues, and we'll deal with ours.
I think all the big powers should be involved in the Middle East to stabilize it. So, yes, I think Russia should play a role.
So I want to just go with one guy who says we need a balance of power, no one world power. With all the chaos you've mentioned, Iraq, the US, you're laughing. I mean,
of course, because there's no balance of power. There is no such thing.
In the next decade, is that
there is no such thing in the world. There was always one dominant power. Even if we look at the Cold War, which was cold enough, back then, when everything unveiled, it was obvious that there was one side that had more power. I'm not talking about deterrence, I'm talking about power. We have an issue of standoff right now. The standoff is not because the US and Germany are not seeing eye to eye. The standoff is because Germany has issues within the EU and the US has issues within the US. So they're both kind of like leaning back and trying to bet the odds. I think I agree with the Iranian issue, but it's a US policy.
And it's all about interests, national interests in the
Obviously.
That's the way nations should run their business.
That's the way it should go. So let's go back for the last minute. Football in Egypt. Is the mess in Egypt actually going to get greater? Is this sort of a symptom of division within Egypt?
Well, you could look at it very symbolically speaking. Why? And also talking about international relationship, if you want to look at it as a football match. The name of the stadium was the aerial defense. The name of one of the clubs, it was El Zamalek versus a club called El Amri. The name of this club was, ironically speaking, White Knights.
So it all comes down to football in the end, the Middle East. Unfortunately, we have to end on that. It's seemingly simple, but you'll come back and explain more of it in a coming day, I'm sure. Dr. Hani Zubeida, Avi Melamed, thanks very much for being with me. And we're going out for 2 minutes, and we're back with the rest of the news today. Don't go anywhere. Vladimir Putin arrives for a 2-day trip to Egypt in a bid to boost influence in the Middle East, while tension boils in the Egyptian street and the blame turns to police after at least 19 die in a football game turned violent. In a joint press conference at the White House on Ukraine, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the peace of Europe itself is at stake. And despite denials from the Israeli Labor Party, I-24 News finds that one of the main financial backers of the political nonprofit V15 has also donated money to Labor Party leader Isaac Herzog. Welcome back, and we begin now with the Ukraine crisis and talks that today shifted to Washington. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is at the White House to brief U.S. President Barack Obama on the European stance, after new talks were set for Wednesday in Minsk. In a joint press conference after the meeting, both seemed to deliver strong messages. Obama warned that the West can't allow Russia to redraw Europe's borders, quote, at the barrel of a gun, while Merkel stated that a peaceful order of Europe is at stake. The EU, for its part, has delayed further sanctions against Moscow. And with me is investigative journalist Martin Himmel. Good evening.
Good evening.
So we have very strong statements from President Barack Obama against Russia, and at the same time, U.S. plans, will they or won't they, to arm Ukraine. Where does the U.S. stand on that? Because Europe is sort of trying to talk Obama out of it, it looks like.
Well, I think there's a bit of a good cop, bad cop approach here. The good cop is Europe saying to the Russians, look, be reasonable. This is not 1940s, 1930s. It's not the Cold War in the 1950s. The United States wants to arm the Ukraine, quit it. And the United States is sort of playing the bad cop, saying, well, maybe force has to meet force here to keep them limited. It's hard to say if this is deliberate or it's just accidental, but clearly that's the dynamic that's going on. And as Russia moves either towards an agreement, I guess the U.S. threat will lessen, and if it moves away from an agreement, then they will probably arm them to a certain degree.
Judging by Putin's sort of flexing of the muscles of the last several months, an increasing death toll, continued fighting, more and more meetings with no real results, does it look like it's it's gone too far to go back, to turn back the Ukraine crisis?
No, I don't think it's too far. I think it's really going to be a game of how much territory Putin feels he can get in the short term to hold it and then to go into endless negotiations. Once he feels, maybe if he feels the United States is going to arm, or maybe he feels that his sanctions are going to have too difficult a bite, that's where he'll stop. Until then, he'll push for more territory to get the Russian sphere of Ukraine into his area. So once he gets there, they'll probably stop, and that will be the line for who knows how many years of negotiations.
Turning for a moment to the policy in Washington, how far do you think Obama is willing to go face-to-face in a standoff with Russia, as we've seen? A lot of talk for the last even 2 years about the new Cold War and so on. With Obama, with a sort of foreign policy focus in his last part of his term in office, how far will he take it?
I don't think he's going to push to reconquer the Crimea or to push to reconquer the Donbass. That's the Russian area of Ukraine. I think that his red line is that the Russians can't march all the way to Kiev, which is already Western Ukraine. And if it means that Western Ukraine will be in a sphere of influence that's aligned with the EU and Eastern Ukraine is in a sphere of influence that's aligned with Russia, that might be the new balance. But I think he doesn't want it to expand.
Well, we'll see what happens in Minsk on Wednesday, if that happens at all. Martin Himmel, thanks very much for being with me. We're moving now to Afghanistan, to Helmand province. A drone strike is said to have killed 6 people, one of them a former Guantanamo Bay detainee, believed to have left the Taliban to join the Islamic State group. Afghanistan's intel agency released a statement saying the man, Mullah Abdul Rauf, was in charge of IS in southwest Afghanistan and was reportedly also recruiting for the group. And nearby to Iraq, another suicide bombing attack in the country today claimed the lives of an estimated 12 people in Baghdad. The U.S. said it may deploy ground troops in the country as early as April this year to support the Iraqi government in countering terror. But of course, following the rising death toll in neighboring Syria from coalition airstrikes, not everyone is certain that U.S. involvement is the answer for Iraq. More from Ayman Siksek.
Just 2 days after announcing the lift of a years-long curfew in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad was rocked by a suicide bombing attack, killing at least 15 people and wounding dozens of others. Monday's bombing in Adnan Square, home to one of the holiest shrines in Shiite Islam, took place in broad daylight.
The man came out from the vehicle. There were cameras. He walked, hopped in his jacket, and blew himself up.
No person or group has immediately claimed responsibility for the bombings, the latest in a string of deadly attacks in the Iraqi capital in the last 2 weeks. On Saturday, at least 37 people were killed in bombings in New Baghdad. Just 1 day before Monday's attack, Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, addressed the international community in Munich.
We in Iraq are facing a formidable new terror generation, which is not only threatening Iraq, it is threatening the region, it is threatening the whole world at the moment, and we should get all the support possible to do that.
And U.S. efforts to counter the spread of the IS in Iraq may soon evolve. The U.S. Central Command said this week it may deploy ground troops to support the Iraqi operation in the city of Mosul, some 400 kilometers north of Baghdad. Meanwhile, in Iraq, the news of the lift of the curfew sparked short-lived celebrations. On Saturday, shops and commercial spots in Baghdad remained open during evening hours for the first time in years, in a brief attempt to enjoy the end of the curfew, aimed against all odds at normalizing life in the war-torn city.
And the Palestinian Authority is planning to ban products manufactured by 6 of the biggest Israeli foodstuff producers from entry and consumption in the West Bank. In a press conference in Ramallah, Fatah members said products will be banned in West Bank markets as of February 11th due to what they term as Israeli violations in the area, including the building of Jewish settlements and the freezing of Palestinian tax revenues. Those were in response to Abbas's move to join 20 international treaties at the end of last year, including, of course, the International Criminal Court. And moving now to Israel elections. Less than 2 months out, elections in Israel have not been short of controversy. Last week, our correspondent Eli Ochenberg reported on the involvement of American advisors from both the Republican and Democratic parties in Israeli campaigns. Tonight, she joins me with the latest, this time on funding.
Yes, that's true. Well, V15 is a non-profit Israeli organization with a very specific target, replacing the Israeli government. And in recent weeks, this group caused a serious mayhem, raising many questions regarding its political orientation and its funding. And the right wing claimed it is connected to the Israeli left wing, allegations that were repeatedly denied by both the organization and the Israeli left. But tonight we revealed that there is, in fact, a very interesting connection. But before we elaborate, let's see the report. One of the most dominant issues in the current Israeli election race revolves around the alleged hidden agenda and funding of the non-profit political group V15, which, in collaboration with One Voice Israel, is calling for replacing the government. The right wing, led by the Likud party, had publicly claimed the group is supported by the American Democratic Party and that it is connected to the left-wing Zionist Union, the Likud's main rival in the elections. These claims have been vigorously denied by all involved. Only last Friday, one of the main financial supporters of V15, Jewish-American businessman Daniel Abraham, evaded the claim he contributes funds to the Zionist Union leader Isaac Herzog.
There were claims by members of Likud and by Likud that this group, this V15, is related to one of the candidates in the political campaign in Israel, the Zionist camp, or to Meretz. Do you know of any such connection?
Absolutely not. I do not know.
One may assume that maybe you're helping this V15 group in order to help his son, Yitzhak Herzog, to be the next prime minister.
Yitzhak Herzog. I think he's a great man and a great Israeli patriot.
But I-24 News has discovered that Abrahams does not only provide financial support to V15, but also to the person V15 claims to have no relation to, Zionist Union and Labour Party leader Isaac Herzog. In the Israeli State Comptroller's report from 2014, referring to the Labour Party primaries held in 2013, which Herzog won, Abraham appears on Herzog's list of donors with a contribution of 21,154 shekels, or just over $6,000. In the 2012 report, referring to the 2011 Labour primary elections, Abraham's name appears once again with a donation of 38,720 shekels, about $11,000, for candidate Isaac Herzog. Given this, it now appears much more difficult to deny any connection between V15 and Isaac Herzog, the man who wants to replace Benjamin Netanyahu in the Prime Minister's office.
So, Eli, I understand you have now a response from the Israeli Labour Party to this report.
Yes, well, the Labour Party continues to claim that there is no connection between Herzog or the Zionist Union to the activity of V15, but considering that the latest donation was only recently in the last Labour primary election, the same elections that turned Herzog to be the leader of the party, it seems a bit far-fetched to claim that there is no absolute connection. And furthermore, following the extensive media coverage and the chaos, the Israeli State Comptroller decided to examine this issue. And in a letter he sent to the Central Election Committee, he says that all linkages between V15 and One Voice, two Israeli parties, will go under in-depth examination. And he's not ruling out the possibility that the activity of those organizations will be eventually found out to be forbidden. So we will, of course, keep on following this.
Another important report, and I have a feeling you'll have a few more before this election cycle is up. Eli Ochenberg, thanks very much for this.
Thank you.
Now, the terror attacks in Paris on the Charlie Hebdo paper and a kosher supermarket sparked a series of reactions, a massive solidarity march with world leaders and security meetings on how Europe must deal with terror in its territory. But where does all of this stand 1 month later? Maxime Perez and Ayman Siksek take a look.
1 month ago, a bloody shooting attack decimated the editorial board of Charlie Hebdo. In total, 17 people died in January during the Paris attacks. 1 month later, France is not in shock anymore, but has learned to live under the constant threat of terror. Since January, over 10 persons have been arrested. A jihadist suspect connected to the Kouachi brothers was arrested in Bulgaria moments before he embarked for Syria. 2 more close relations of the Kouachi brothers were also apprehended at the Turkey-Syria border, while 3 others managed to enter Syria before the attacks. Among them, Hayat Boumediene, Amadi Koulibaly's life partner, who was caught on camera here at the Istanbul airport. France's security alert was raised to its highest level throughout the country. 5,000 soldiers have been deployed to protect synagogues and Jewish community centers. France has to get used to living under high security.
It is a military operation, and this is why it received the name of military operation. This is why it has been called Operation Sentinel.
The state of alert is almost permanent. Last week in Nice, a man named Moussa Koulibaly wounded 3 soldiers in a stabbing attack. A complaint was made to the anti-terrorist prosecution unit. The branch of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which took responsibility for the attack against Charlie Hebdo, claimed it considers France as the Great Satan, Islam's worst enemy. And what if the current situation benefited the far right? The National Front is without a doubt the biggest winner of this climate of fear, which has taken over France.
I believe the Paris attacks ensure the trust many French people have in the National Front. For one simple reason, the National Front got the picture right several years ago. It had the courage, alone against all, to evaluate the danger of the Islamist extremism in France.
A wake-up call for both right and left-wing parties in France, but the outcome of the presidential election is still far from over.
And now to HSBC and economy. With me is Daniel Roth from the I-24 News Economy magazine. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, HSBC, 200 countries and $119 billion.
Yes. This is how much was in the accounts that are related to tax avoidance or tax evasion or money laundering, these 3 areas, 2 of them being majorly illegal, 1 of them being not illegal. Tax avoidance is the game of avoiding through legal means. But HSBC is essentially, it's come out that they're responsible for a massive amount of tax evasion, tax avoidance, and money laundering. Massive.
Swiss leaks.
Yes.
As it's being called. So the UK regulators are now sort of in charge of this, I understand. It's being discussed in the UK right now. This much, you're talking about $119 billion, this many countries involved. Does HSBC have a way out of this? They've only had a sort of partial admission so far.
Well, so first of all, there's a couple of countries investigating. The UK is taking the lead right now because it is a UK-based bank. Now, to be clear, it was in one of their Swiss subsidiaries, so it's really an international story. But you're talking about $119 billion out of a company that's got $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion. Wow. So that's a drop in the bucket.
Money you can't even really process what that means.
Right. I certainly can't. But here's the thing. In 2012, HSBC was fined $1.9 billion, which was a record amount. Now, when you think about it, they're responsible for this $119 billion that's involved in this case. They're worth nearly $3 trillion. And the most that they've been fined is $1.9 billion. It's a drop in a bucket.
Which is maybe what, just a speculation, but maybe what allows them to continue to do this kind of thing. If it is true, if it's only a small fine and a drop in the bucket, as you say, not so big a deal.
Indeed.
All right, will be interesting to see if they get a bigger fine this time. Daniel Roth, thanks very much for this.
Thank you.
And now we continue with our profiles of Israeli members of parliament back to Israeli elections ahead of the March vote. Today we meet Tamar Zandberg from the left-wing party Meretz in a visit to the unique Liberation Ranch where farm animals are saved from slaughter and abuse. I-24 News correspondent Jaffa Port accompanied her quest for animal rights.
At first glance, the pastoral green field in northern Israel, where cows, hens and other farm animals walk freely, seems like any small family ranch. But a closer look reveals a story of survival, as these animals were saved from slaughterhouses and factory farms. Visiting the place is Israeli parliament member Tamar Zandberg from the left-wing party Meretz. An animal rights activist herself, she takes a glance at the work of the young revolutionaries.
Everything was filled with trash, and we came here and we took everything and we made it like it looks now. So
yeah, it looks amazing.
So all the animals could finally experience their freedom.
What kind of help do you need?
From defending animals against abuse to promoting vegan kitchens in official state institutions, Zandberg is now trying to increase awareness of farm animal sanctuaries and the atrocities of factory farming.
The animal industry is the biggest polluter in the world, and this is just an industry that produces more and more, and it doesn't feed the people who need it.
But in the turbulent Middle Eastern reality, Israelis appear to be more concerned about their security in the fight against terror rather than animal rights.
You cannot focus on terror and neglect the poverty, and vice versa, because, you know, social justice does not stop in the green line.
Zandberg herself does not stop with animals, one of the parliament's most active legislators. With over 380 law proposals in the past 20 months, she is committed to her agenda, which includes promoting urban planning, public transportation and fighting discrimination. Earlier this week, Meretz made a shift in its campaign and stood out against Labour Party leader Herzog, although announcing they will recommend him as premier. Recent polls predict the small party might be scratching the parliament entry threshold as they lose votes to the Labour.
We do say to our left-wing voters, be careful, because if you wake up one day after the elections to find out that Meretz is not big enough and your vote was given to Tzipi Livni or Herzog that would go in to Netanyahu's government, you would be sorry.
But as the threshold knife looms over her party, Zandberg remains calmly optimistic, truly believing change in the perception of the Israeli society is possible.
It is within our ability to convince our Israelis to choose differently, to choose for change.
And now to sports. And joining me is host of the I-24 News Sports Magazine, Jonathan Regev.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, as always, you have a whole range of different sports things. I understand the Ivory Coast, big win for them.
Yes, and what a drama. Was the final of the Asian Cup, of the African Cup, I'm sorry, we spoke about it yesterday. Avram Grant was leading Ghana to the final. We were hoping he would win. And it was goalless after 120 minutes, and the Ivory Coast won in penalties. We saw what that did to their fans back home.
Only in sports matches do you see that kind of celebration.
Yes.
Fans like nowhere else.
And they're especially happy because it seemed lost. After two penalties, Ghana was up 2-0. The Ivory Coast actually missed their first two penalties. It seemed gone by then.
And this is the first time in a really long time they're getting this
the Ivory Coast is one of the strongest countries in African football, and yet this is only the second time they won the African Cup. First time since 1992. Back then, who did they beat in the final? Ghana by penalties.
And the Israeli coach of Ghana is not so good with the penalties.
No, it's not the first time he had such an agonizing loss. Back in 2008, he was the manager of Chelsea. They were also about to beat Manchester City in Manchester United in the Champions League final, losing by penalties again.
I wonder what's worse, losing by a lot or losing by just that little bit that you were so close?
Just that little bit, for sure.
No question. Okay, so how about some violence in football? Not only in Egypt, we spoke about all the 19 deaths in Egypt.
So I'm bringing violence, no deaths this time. It happened in Greece, the match between PAOK Saloniki and Olympiacos. These are big rivals in Greece. And we're seeing the pictures here. It looks nice. It looks very flary, I would say.
I don't know if it looks nice. It looks a little...
But it does look a little dangerous. And the game got a little violent at the end. Some of the Olympiacos players who were the visitors here. They were actually, every time they went to kick some corner kick, things were thrown at them from the stands. Here we saw things got a little violent. No deaths this time, and the game ended with no goals, by the way.
That's a good standard to have for
I know. No deaths, the game ended, good.
So in the little time we have left, you always have some kind of, the more extreme races, they just keep getting more extreme.
Yes, and I don't know if you've heard sky running. It's an ultra marathon, only 50 kilometers.
Because a regular marathon is not enough.
It's easy peasy, as we say. So, but they don't just run on the track, just let's climb some mountains, run down. If we can make it harder, why not? So 50 kilometers of this race, and this is just the first race of the season. It's the Asian sky running competition. There'll be more of these to come, and these people,
that's extreme uphill, too.
Yes, extreme uphill, 50 kilometers of this. Easy.
No big deal.
We do that every day.
I'll do that twice next week, just so you know. All right, Jonathan Regev, thanks very much.
Thank you, Nurit.
And now to a connection between an essential gene and striking gender differences affecting patients with autism and Alzheimer's. Both of those may open the path towards battling the diseases. I-24 News correspondent Jaffa Port met the Israeli researcher behind the revelation and explains.
I have Alzheimer's disease, early onset.
Julianne Moore's latest portrayal of a professor who receives the devastating diagnosis sheds light on a disease which affects women twice as much as men. And Israeli research now explains why.
What we've asked in this particular study that we are discussing is it the same in males and females?
Professor Ilana Gozes has been researching biochemistry for over 3 decades. 15 years ago, she discovered a gene essential for the formation of the brain.
We called it ADNP, activity-dependent neuroprotective protein, because it protects nerve cells against electrical blockade. ADNP was very recently found to be mutated in autism. So this is a very strong connection, and also ADNP may change in Alzheimer's disease.
Published in the prestigious Translational Psychiatry magazine, Professor Gozes' latest study revealed groundbreaking results. The gene regulates differently in men and women, explaining why males are 4 times more likely to suffer from autism than females, and why Alzheimer's is more common in women.
It's opening a door to think about our brains not as the same like males and females. Also, when we design drugs, we have to be very careful in clinical trial design, because the female and the male, or the boy and the girl, won't react exactly the same.
Today, there is no separation between men and women in terms of mental or neurological diseases. Thus, the new study might be revolutionary for developing the cure.
If there is a difference, we should treat males and females, or men and women, separately, and think about it, how to help in a better way.
Gozes and her team now have a drug candidate in their lab, one of the most useful findings which could lead the way for a disease-fighting drug.
It enhances ADNP activity, I think, for the better.
In the meantime, they continue the lab work, providing a ray of hope to millions.
I am in touch with the families of the children with ADNP mutation, and I would love to help them. And you know, we all know people with Alzheimer's disease. So this is another population that I would really love to help.
And now to culture. So she was just with us with health news. Shachar, now you join us, Shachar Port, with a bit of lighter news, with the Grammys, with the biggest musical event of the year.
Yes, thank God for culture, so we can finish things up in a lighter mood. Yes, 2015 Grammy Awards. It was a long evening. 83 prizes were handed out. It
And
was
probably
a long
only
evening.
4 or so that people actually tune in for.
And it was definitely the night of Sam Smith, also known as the new Adele, 20-year-old singer star, making Taylor Swift look suddenly old with all her 26 years. He swept the
20 years
Grammys,
old.
yes,
That's
winning 4 prizes, including Best Song for Stay With Me, Best Record in the Lonely Hour, and Best New Artist. This was definitely his night. As part of what has become a tradition, we remember Taylor Swift's 2009 speech that was interrupted by Kanye West. This year, he once again stormed the stage. This time it was during Beck's speech.
So he actually got on stage? I missed the
got
awards,
on stage.
but I already commented.
Beck won Best Album for Morning Phase, and it seemed like he changed his mind in the middle. He eventually shook his hand, so it was sort of congratulating him, but and Prince was there, of course. and it was a fun event once again. Did you see that?
Yeah,
it seems like it was
quite
confusing, but there was also good news for Kanye. Most exciting performance of the evening definitely went to him and the amazing trio Kanye, Rihanna, and Sir Paul McCartney. A very interesting combination. In fact, it was a night of interesting combinations. They performed 4-5 Seconds, which will be upcoming in the Rihanna West album, but we also got a glimpse of Gwen Stefani and Maroon 5's Adam Levine and a performance from them. Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett, who released together an album called Cheek to Cheek, which won, by the way. They performed as well, so this
was
a lot of
unexpected combinations.
Yes, new and old together, and I think this was sort of what defined this event. There were the old veteran performers. We got Madonna, we got those who we're used to, and fresh new
and
beat.
It's always good to have Sir Paul McCartney.
Exactly, and I think this is what the Grammy is all about. And of course, there's no Grammy without Beyonce. Her 20th win this time, R&B Best Performance for Drunk in Love. There's no Grammy without Beyonce, and this time some say she was robbed for the album, but still
clearly,
she got
as
her
Kanye
win.
West has proven, there will always be the detractors.
Exactly, and
after,
happily, Pharrell Williams also took the prize, Best Video Clip and Best Pop Solo, of course, for Happy, though he did give a somber performance of Happy on stage.
But
sort
of remix.
Yes, something like that, but it was still very much happy to see him. Also, some revivals. We had AC/DC opening the evening, and ELO, which everyone was very happy
Okay, now I have to
hear
go
their
back
songs.
and watch it. I missed it, but you've inspired me to go see some of the performances. Shaham
Highly
as
recommend it.
always. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going out for just 2 minutes, and we'll be back with the Daily Debate, Israel Elections 2015. Don't go anywhere, lots of controversy.